Welcome to All Our Children's webinar. I'm Lally Lloyd, Director of All Our Children. I'm delighted to have everybody with us this afternoon. I want you to know about our upcoming national conference, All Our Children, the Church's Role in Education Equity, which is happening in January 16 to 18 in Columbia, South Carolina. I'll say more about this call at the end of our call. It's going to be 2.5 days of amazing opportunities to meet other people and learn together. And you can find more information at aoc2018.org. So here's what we're going to do this afternoon. After a couple of introductions, we'll have a conversation for about 30 minutes and followed by 15 minutes of question and answer, followed by a brief evaluation, and we will wrap up this open part of our webinar at 3:45. Our webinar is being recorded, and Mary Liz Murray, All Our Children's Director of Communications, will be monitoring our chat board. Mary Liz, will you explain how that chat function works?
Sure. Hi, everybody. If you are not familiar with Zoom or you haven't used the chat feature in Zoom before, you're going to find it in the menu that runs along the bottom of your screen when you hover over the presenters. I'm just going to share my screen briefly so that you can see where it is. So let's see, will it let me do that? No, it won't. So a menu like this up at the top here will pop up along the bottom, and there'll be a little thing that says chat, and it will be blinking when people are chatting in there. Right now there's a question live to all of you to please introduce who you are and where you're tuning in from, and this is a place where I will be asking some questions of all of you. There'll be some polls for you to participate in as the conversation goes. And if you have questions as we go through our discussion, this is the place to ask them. I'll be keeping track of your questions, who they're for. And during our Q&A at the end of the conversation, I'll be able to direct your questions to the right place. So as things come up for you, please do put them in the chat box so that I can see them and we can address them at the end.
Thanks, Mary Liz. I'm going to open us with a word of prayer, so please join me. Oh God, you made us in your image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away our arrogance and hatred when they infect our hearts. Break down walls that separate us, unite us in bonds of love, and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth. That in your good time, all peoples, nations, and races may serve you here on earth in this time and worship you in harmony around your heavenly throne. We ask you this through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
All Our Children's mission is to build the movement for education equity by supporting congregations, their members, who are exploring, forming, and leading community partnerships with public schools. We do this because too many children, most of them living in poverty and many of them children of color, receive a substandard education. And we do not believe that this is God's dream. We believe Jesus shows the church how to engage our communities as our neighbors, how to serve children, and how to challenge injustice. To learn more about our work and our vision, please visit us at allourchildren.org. This afternoon's topic is avoiding toxic charity. We seek to build ministries that work with our neighbors rather than doing for our neighbors. So we'll be exploring ways congregations can create mutually affirming partnerships with schools. We will be drawing and referring to a document called Becoming Beloved Community that is a core part of the Episcopal Church's vision for our life as a community of faith going forward. But we'll be holding those concepts a little bit lightly. So if you're very familiar with that document, you may recognize it. And Mary Liz is going to put a URL into the chat box so that you can look up more about it if you're inclined. Today's panelists, I'm thrilled to introduce them, are Fran Early. Hi, Fran, wave your hand.
Hi.
Here's Fran. Fran is a community organizer in Boston, an activist, and the author of Doing Good Says Who. Heidi Kim, hi Heidi, is the staff officer for racial reconciliation in the Episcopal Church. And Marilyn Lee, hey Marilyn, is the executive director of Loving Houston. And she's really excited about her baseball team. Fran, Heidi, and Marilyn, thanks for being with us this afternoon. Fran, will you start off the introductions and say a couple words about yourself?
Sure, I'm Fran Early, and I guess my claim to fame for these purposes is the book, Doing Good Says Who, which is based on over 400 interviews, written, by the way, with a good friend and co-writer, Connie Newton, who is living in Guatemala, but it's based on over 400 interviews in Guatemala with volunteers, donors, NGOs, but most importantly, most uniquely with the intended beneficiaries of all that goodwill. I also do interfaith community organizing in Boston, which fits very much with this theme also, since one of our primary premises is never do for someone what they can do for themselves, never.
Fran, do you want to say a little bit about times that you've either experienced toxic charity or perpetrated it?
Well, I'm going to go back to age 6. Living in a little country town in Virginia, come home from school on the first day, all excited to have a new friend. Her name is Gay Brown. She wants me to come home with her tomorrow. My mother says, well, when I get a note from her mother or something, we'll set that up. My father says, they don't have a phone and they can't write, but they're wonderful people. It's okay. I go to Gay Brown's house and have the time of my life. And so the first part of the story that's important is that I just have never since then, when I see what some people call poverty, I see people I want to get to know because I'm pretty sure I'm going to miss some fun. But the second part of the story that's been formative for my life is Gay Brown and I dressed quite alike. We both had, our moms made our clothes, and a church in town, deeming her poor, gave her their old castaway clothes. She wouldn't be caught dead in what they gave her, and she didn't need them. And at age 6, it was clear to me that it was insulting. And fast forward in Boston a few years ago, sitting around the table with a bunch of homeless people and a bunch of liberal church people, talking about what we needed to do for the homeless. And the church people are saying, well, we need to raise money and build houses. And it was clear the homeless people were a little nudgy. And so anyway, we asked them what, and of course what they wanted were toilets on the street and a place to store their clothes. And they helped us settle in and do something that was truly useful to them.
Thank you.
That's.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Heidi, introduce yourself, a little bit about your work, and then some thoughts about your own experiences on this topic.
Sure. I'm Heidi Kim. I'm calling in today from Bellevue, Washington, which is my home, which I rarely get to be here. I recognize some of the names of folks who are logging in the chat, so welcome to all my friends from far and wide. I am the staff officer for racial reconciliation for the Episcopal Church, so I serve on the presiding bishop's staff. For those of you who are not Episcopalians, that means that I'm a denominational employee rather than the employee of a particular diocese or parish. And that becoming beloved community plan has been a significant part of my work for the last 3 years since I came on board as a member of the PB staff. The toxic charity piece is a really interesting one. I saw that Eliza Marth is on this call, and Eliza came with us when we did a pilgrimage in Ferguson, Missouri. And one of the things that we learned while we were there and after we left was that there were a lot of folks who were coming to Ferguson after the death of Michael Brown, who were very intent on telling the people there what they needed to do and how they should change. there were a lot of activists. It was very high profile, and including there were, several priests from the Episcopal Church who had said to the people and the clergy in Ferguson from various denominations that they weren't doing it right, because they weren't out there getting arrested and being very public, and they were mostly, the clergy in Ferguson were more concerned about actually serving their parishioners by getting them food and water and toilet paper and diapers in a time when the city had become completely militarized. And of course, after that, the activists left, and folks who lost their jobs during that time because the buses stopped running are still, some of them are still looking for employment. Property rates in that town continue to go down. There continue to be efforts around economic empowerment and economic development in Ferguson. And what we saw there was an idea that there was a particular strategy that was the best strategy for that group of folks in that time, and it wasn't necessarily what the folks who lived there themselves wanted, similar to what Fran was describing of thinking that we know best. And we saw something a little bit similar to that in the Standing Rock Reservation, with the way that people were not necessarily listening to the people who lived on the reservation, in how the camps grew up, in the kind of activism that was coming about. I'll leave it at that, and if folks have questions, I want to keep this as short as I can. I think you're on mute, Lally.
Thank you, Heidi. I'm sure we'll get back to you with lots of questions. Marilyn, please introduce yourself and reflect a little bit on our question of today and your own experience.
All right, I'm Marilyn Lee. I'm the Executive Director of Loving Houston, and I am very excited about the Astros tonight. I can't wait. Loving Houston, we were formed about 3 or 4 years ago, just with the idea that we wanted to see the church out there loving Houston. We thought that we would do this big survey project just to see how churches were serving the community. And we had a conversation with a professor here. He's a great researcher, really well known in the Houston area, Dr. Stephen Kleinberg. And he mentioned to us that, you know what, when adults get into consistent, caring relationships with children, that just makes all the difference in the world. At the same time, we were also talking with Kevin Palau of the Luis Palau Association, and they had done some amazing things in Portland around churches and schools. And so just all of these conversations, we just realized, you know what, if we encourage our churches to build relationships with schools, all of these challenges that are in our communities are going to be addressed in some capacity. I mean, within our schools, there are all of the challenges in our communities are basically present in our schools. And so by building relationships, by the church members building relationships with the teachers, with the kids, with the parents, working together alongside each other for the good of the community, we really think that that's going to be powerful and transformational for communities across Greater Houston. And so that's what we do. We help churches to serve local schools here in Houston. And one example of toxic charity, and this is embarrassing for me because I work for an organization that is helping churches to serve schools. And our organization helped the church that I attend start a partnership with the school. And within this partnership, my small group that my husband and I lead, we are partnered specifically with one classroom. And so I think we got the first part right. So we didn't come in with an agenda. We didn't come in saying, hey, this is what we think your classroom needs, Ms. Montoya. We asked her how we could help. But the problem is it wasn't a mutually collaborative relationship thing. It was, how can we help you? What can we get you? How can we help you, basically? And so each week she comes back with a list of supplies or a list of things that we can help them out with. But it's not that kind of collaborative, mutually life-giving partnership. It's us doing for them what I think Fran said this a second ago, what they can maybe do for themselves. And so like one thing going forward I'm thinking about is maybe I have this conversation with Ms. Montoya saying, okay, how can we maybe do like a school supply drive together, like with the students, so empowering them to come alongside us, working together, thinking of some creative ideas about how we can help this whole classroom together, us alongside them, get the school supplies that they need for their class. So that's just one real simple example of how I've seen toxic charity just recently, just in the past couple of weeks. So.
Lally, unmute.
It's part of our ongoing conversion is to be becoming aware of this more and more in ourselves. Thank you all, three of you, for sharing your stories. Let's start by defining this term, toxic charity. Fran, what do we mean when we use that phrase, toxic charity? Where does that word come from? And can you begin to put a definition on the table for us?
Well, you know, there's a book by Bob Lupton called Toxic Charity, which does a wonderful job of explaining it in depth. But I think, you know, as we wrote our book and as we interviewed all these people, one of the things, the way I started describing it was, we in the Western world think we have answers. We feel so blessed, so lucky, we want to share, and we've been taught to do for people. And so over and over again, we saw volunteers saying, we're so lucky, saying or acting out, we're so lucky, you're so poor, we're going to give you what we know you need, which is fundamentally insulting. And there's a doctor, I watched this doctor racing around screaming at people, and my Spanish wasn't so good, and I said to the European midwife standing beside me, who was a friend, what's going on? And she said, well, he's just received, somebody gave him a sonogram machine and he's putting it together and he's having trouble. And so I said, well, you look angry. What's going on with you? And she said, well, Fran, what's happening is the purpose of a sonogram machine is to identify birth defects. And if they identify any birth defects, there is not a shot of their being able to do anything about it. So it's useless. But what is happening is that the midwives in the mountains are lining up their pregnant women to come down and find out if it's a boy or girl, because they make more money if it's a boy.
Oh.
So
Yeah.
Good intentions play out in many, many ways. And whoever gave him the sonogram machine, and his intentions were great. He continued to be an enigma to me. I interviewed him several times because he got a big kitchen with stainless steel and made a modern kitchen to teach women who cook on their knees on fires in their homes on the floor, teach them nutrition in a perfect modern kitchen, which obviously wasn't terribly useful. So, but simultaneously in the same place, I saw school teachers, retired, moved to this mountain village, who saw no books. And one teacher had 2 classrooms. They literally locked the door and run next door. And they both, their first instinct was, we're going to buy books. And then they both were educators in the States, and they said, we know better. We're going to hang out at the school, get to know the teachers, the parents, and find out what's going on. And as they did, they discovered that the teachers had most likely sold the books because they don't make enough money to feed their families. But they really wanted books. And so they got each teacher to pick a book. They went into town and duplicated a book for each class with a blank page on top where each student could put their name and their own drawing and call it their own. And those books didn't get sold. And those 2 things were side by side about 50 feet from each other, those 2 activities.
Thank you for that. Heidi, do you want to add anything to that sort of definition or picture of what toxic charity means?
Sure. The example that you were talking about, Fran, really made me think of, when folks have come into poorer places in the world, including in the United States, and said, well, the kind of technology that we really think is necessary, the folks here they won't know how to take care of it. And the sort of the paternalism on the opposite side, kind of the flip side of what you were talking about. I've seen that quite a bit. But I also know that many Episcopalians, anyway, I think people of faith throughout the world, their good intentions come in again, and we expect that the impact that we would think would happen in our own environment is the impact that will occur everywhere else as well. And I have seen that since my work is racial reconciliation, but I come from education, I've seen a little bit of this in churches where we'll say, why should we engage in racial reconciliation? And literally many people have said, because I would like my congregation to look more diverse. And, bless their hearts for, wanting to embrace the diversity of the body. And yet without sort of thinking about, well, why do you want it to look more diverse? Do you want it to actually also be more diverse? Do you want it to actually be a place of welcome and inclusion for these diverse people that are going to make you, look more diverse? Or is this about a kind of narcissism that we have about, we're such great people, we're so inclusive, let's pat ourselves on the back because we did this thing, or because we wrote this check, or because we took a group of high school students down to Mexico to paint a wall that the kids from the church down the street are going to paint a different color next week, when nobody actually wants a painted wall. What they really want is to be in partnership and learn from one another and to be in right relationship. So I think sometimes we get caught up in the doing for piece because it means that we don't actually have to change, that we don't necessarily have to engage in that reconciliation with God and with one another, and maybe be transformed by our experiences of being with others whose lives are very unlike ours. I generally find that in those places where I've done any kind of real sort of partnership or relationship building, I am the one who benefits because I have an opportunity to hear with new ears and see with new eyes and love with a bigger heart. Not that I'm a Christian or anything.
One of the places where we've seen the most fruitful development over many years of partnership with the school and with the community is at St. Stephen's Church on the South End in Boston. And I think one of the things that sets that community apart is the rector and the assistant rector have been there for more than 10 years, each of them. I think it's close on 15 years now. And they both have backgrounds as community organizers, as does Fran. And what that meant, and I think the difference it made, was that when they arrived as leaders of this small, struggling congregation, they started by getting to know their people. And they started by asking what they need, what the community needs. And the answer was, we need a safe place for our children to do homework after school with some adult supervision. The church is physically located between an elementary school and the housing project, so they were well located to provide that service. And they, of course, most of the church's rooms were empty Monday through Friday afternoons. And so that's how they got started. And it feels like that's a direct positive example of the way that we can be building authentic relationship. And then, like a mustard seed, this program has grown over 15 years because, not surprisingly, as they've gotten more and more embedded in their local community, new opportunities come up. Maybe they feel like needs, but they often feel like opportunities for partnership. And it's a long and rich story in that particular example, but I just wanted to sketch out that example of what it can look like when it does well. Let's see, Marilyn, I wonder if you can reflect a little bit, and I may be asking you to sort of imagine this if you've not yourself actually experienced it, but like, what's so bad about being charitable? Is there suffering that we're actually introducing either to other people or in ourselves as congregations? And we're going to sit with this question for a little while, so it may feel like a big one, but let's see if we can sort of shed some light on. I invite you to get started first.
Ooh, that is a big question.
Or we can open it up to Fran or Heidi too, and then give you a little bit of a chance to think about that. Is there suffering that's caused? And if so, how does the congregation suffer?
So I'll say, when I worked at a Jesuit high school, they talked about the 2 feet of justice, which are charity and justice making, right? That if we want to be engaged in the world, charity has its place, right? So if we want to be building programs and we want to be developing relationships, and those things cost money, then sometimes charity is appropriate. I think for your situation right now, Marilyn, being in Houston, people in Houston need a lot of resources right now, so that is important. But I think sometimes the notion of charity lets us off the hook for the longer term, marathon engagements of actually being in relationship with other communities. So for me, one of the most devastating things that happened after the earthquake in Haiti, which is now a long time ago, was that people could text something and donate $10 to the Red Cross and feel like they had actually done something to help Haiti by sending $10 to the Red Cross. Now, we have since learned that the Red Cross actually misused a lot of those funds in Haiti, and it was kind of a second disaster that impacted that community. But that notion that if we just write a check or we give $10 through a text or something, that somehow we have actually done something that will change people's lives, I think can be a little bit of a slippery slope. And then because this year in particular, there have been so many natural disasters that sort of people talk about compassion fatigue. And if it's, I'm going to give $10 here and $10 over there and $10 there. And when you aren't invested in the relationship, there's no reason for you to continue to keep giving money because it just feels like it's so endless and so overwhelming. So I think that the relationship building that may result from an initial charitable outpouring is what really matters. That we want to think about sustainability. We don't want to just sort of be sticking Band-Aids on every latest new thing and have that sort of spiritual ADD that we can have as church. But instead, we want to try to build some sustainable relationships that include both those long-term relationships and partnerships, as well as sometimes we need that charity too.
Yeah, I build on that with 2 points. And one of them is some people it works best for them to be able to give money, but if they're looking at how they give money and to whom they give it, in terms of organizations that are relational, if the principle behind how they're giving money is relationship, not everybody can go have a personal relationship. I mean, I think of a friend of mine who has a wonderful program. She's an Episcopalian from Boston who started an incredible program, Mil Milagros, in Guatemala. And she says, I wish everybody didn't have to come see the kids to fund the program because I need to be working with the kids and not touring people around all the time. And yet people want that much relationship in order to be motivated, in a sense, and they feel they're getting a relationship with those people, which they have a little bit of one. But so I'm not fond of throwing out the baby with the bathwater ever, and I don't think it's all one way or the other. But I'm with you, Heidi, that first of all, to me, it is part of my faith. And I have seen the impact on so many people of building relationships in cultures not their own, whether it's culture down the street or a culture out of the country, that we begin to see Christ in the other person. And we begin to see ourselves, therefore, in a very different way. And I think it's deeply spiritual, and it can be a huge growth opportunity. I'm fond of saying to church groups, let's don't talk about what you're going to do to help them. Let's talk about what they can do to help you, which is the biggest compliment you can give them, that you want to learn about them and their lives and what you can learn from them And we can always learn things from whomever it is. And it's deeply humbling and thoroughly enriching in my experience.
So, Fran, I want to stay with you for a minute and ask you to answer that question, perhaps from the other side, and that is how. What does it's implicit in what you're saying, but I want to see if we can make it more direct and explicit. What does a congregation or a Christian give up or lose? I used the word suffering before. That might not be the right word. What do we lose or fail to benefit from by staying in a place of privilege?
Well, staying in any one place all the time tends to be inward looking and not, what do I want to say? I think learning beyond one's own thinking, realizing how much we don't know, and we live in a culture where we spend a lot of time trying to be right, and where we spend a lot of time trying to know a lot of things, and we think we know more than most people benefit from realizing that there is so much we can learn from people who are different from us, so much they can give us, and in the process, we're giving them the world's greatest compliment, which is to be interested in them and their lives and know there's something we can learn from them.
Mm-hmm. Marilyn, what are some things that you see a congregation missing out on if it stays isolated unto itself instead of building these mutual relationships with neighbors, whether it's around schools or around something else?
Mm-hmm. One thing that just stuck out to me in what Fran was just saying about Christians staying in a place of privilege, I think one thing that we gain as Christians as we build relationships with our community is an understanding that each of us is broken and in need of grace. That it's that whole othering of poverty that I just recently read an article on, but not us and them, or us versus them. It's all of us together have had the blessing of experiencing the ultimate grace of Jesus. And as we build relationships with people and we get to know their stories, we get to see their assets, we get to see how awesome our neighbors are, it takes away that divide of the us and them, and it just becomes us working together for the good of our children, for the good of our communities, for the kingdom. And so I think that's something that is gained by building relationships and being in a relationship with those around us.
It's fun.
It's fun, right. Heidi, what does it look like in your experience? What does it look like when a congregation is getting it right? I mean, what would be some of the fruit or some of the evidence? What would you see in a congregation that has the right kind of relationship with its community?
Sometimes what we see is that average Sunday attendance, ASA, which is very important for Episcopal parishes to report every year, starts to matter less than about what's going on every other day of the week. And I also think that sometimes I think I saw on the question there was something about outreach. When we talk about outreach as though it is in that sort of paternalistic or colonial model of, we're going to go do this stuff for those poor people over there. And I think what both Marilyn and Fran have added is it's about our own sort of journey of being transformed. And I think when we get to that place of humility that we figure out, like, boy, there's just so much that we don't know, and there's so much brokenness that maybe we are also a part of, and that is impacting us in ways that we don't yet realize. That when it becomes about you know, the spiritual well-being of everyone, the folks in the neighborhood and the folks in the parish, as opposed to like, well, we should do this because it's a good thing to do. Or we should do this because it's the right thing to do. Because as soon as it gets difficult, then people get really angry. Like, well, it's a sort of like expecting gratitude for the fact that you cared a little bit. And, you know, without having done that discernment about why is this important for actually every one of us, not just for the people who we see as the other. And I think that people rush into what are we going to do and how are we going to do it before they've really grappled with why. I think that's certainly true in the work around racial reconciliation, and people will say, well, it's the right thing to do. One of the, I think the negative outcomes, and someone just pointed out this book to me about, you know, sort of about white folks and class, is that more privileged, sort of highly educated white folks have distanced themselves from white supremacists by doing a lot of shaming of white poverty. And so the brokenness or pain that very poor white folks would be experiencing, that it's been a sort of, well, they're the ones who are doing all of the racist stuff, so it's not us. I don't have to change. I'm just going to externalize everything and point it over there. So we're missing an opportunity to see where struggling white folks, struggling folks of color, struggling refugees and immigrants, all might have something in common that would bring us together as the body as opposed to dividing us. And so, you know, I think sometimes sometimes I think the narrative of the Episcopal Church and other churches that call themselves inclusive makes us actually believe that we are inclusive. I've been in plenty of churches that they'll say, wherever you are in your journey of faith, you're welcome at the table, unless you're homeless, you haven't showered, you're a little bit high. Maybe you look like somebody who doesn't normally step into our church, and our ushers are all trained to just get them right back out the door. So I think we have a lot to answer for, just in terms of our own understandings of what does radical welcome really mean? What does it really look like? And the places that are doing better work are the ones that are really grappling with that question, so that their why is very clear and that it's rooted in every part of their spiritual journey.
And if I can add, just, I think at the heart of everything you're saying, Heidi, is relational meetings first inside a congregation. My experience in the community organizing work is that people race to go do things, as you point out, before they have learned how to listen to and share each other's stories and build the kind of trust that allows them to go do work more effectively. I have a great story of a synagogue in town, and conservative synagogue had just joined our organization, and they wanted to have the next big meeting. And when they then they heard that the executive director of the mosque was going to be co-chairing the meeting, and they said, "Oh, we can't have him co-chair the meeting at our synagogue." And we said, "Well, yeah, we're going to have him co-chair the meeting. If we need to, 3 days before a meeting of 500 people, we will change the venue. But why don't you all do a relational meeting? A few of your leaders, a few of his leaders, and the two of you set it up tomorrow, do a relational meeting, and see where it goes." They did, and of course what they did was to share their very similar stories of oppression, which built extraordinary trust. And when at that meeting, the Muslim walked across the stage and announced they were bringing 50 people to the next big action, the standing ovation was led by the members of that conservative synagogue, and there was not a dry eye in the house. So that gets way beyond talking about racism and things.
Within all our children, we have a resource on our website of 10 steps to a church-school partnership, and the first 5 are all work that the congregation does internally before they go knocking on the door of the superintendent or the principal, because building on the principles that we've been talking about, we're committed to the fact that we need to be clear about what our own self-interest is in this outreach. Why does it matter to us that all children have a high quality education? Why do I care if it's not my child? There are lots of good answers to that, but we need to have our answers, and we need to figure them out, because we need to be able to answer those questions to the school people. We also need to build the other steps, and those first 5 include forming a team, learning how to tell your story, connecting with your leaders, finding out who your leaders tell you that you should know, so that it's not just one person. And I identify with this hypothetical person I'm about to describe, because this is where I was a number of years ago, banging my head against a wall, not getting anywhere, because, you know, I had this bee in my bonnet about this particular issue, and I couldn't figure out, like, why I couldn't move forward. Well, I couldn't move forward because I wasn't building relationships with other people, and I hadn't really done any critical thinking or any prayer or sitting with figuring out where from my own life, my own formative experiences, this passion, this calling emerges. And as I've gotten clearer about being able to tell that story, I can feel internally that my own self is more aligned. I stand with more integrity in this issue, and people can see me with more trust. So these are some of the fruits, I think, both as for individuals and also for congregations of doing this inner work. So what kind of conversations, I know what I want to ask us to think about. How can people who work with volunteers, many of whom are in a different place on that journey than where they might end up at the beginning stages of that journey, how do we most have clarifying conversations, shall we say, with our volunteers when something feels a little off, or we feel that there needs to be like a pause button hit? Does any of the 3 of you have any experience or any stories about wanting to having to sort of take somebody aside or tap somebody on the shoulder or say, you know, we're going to move through this in a different way? Any examples that you can share with our wider conversation that we can all learn from about how to do that both lovingly but clearly?
I don't start with an example, but I start with an approach, because our book has 5 principles. For me, the examples follow good preparation. If you've done good preparation with people who are going to be volunteering, I would recommend they read Doing Good Says Who and discuss it. There's a discussion guide at the end. I know churches that have done that and then reflect while they're in the process of doing the work. And if you begin to create that kind of relationship where people are sharing that, then as things occur, it's comfortable to talk about them and have a group, if it is a group process, help each other about how to deal with it. Part of that training, if I were doing it, would be to set up situations where you're frustrated and you're pretty much blaming. Let's say you're tutoring a young person and that person seems not to give a damn, and you are frustrated as hell. And so how do you deal with that? And what is the outcome with the other person of the different ways you might deal with that? So I would do sort of, I would try to create an environment that makes it much more comfortable to have those discussions.
And to do it in a group context as part of group learning. That's
well, that also creates an environment, if you have a particularly knotty situation, that you can take somebody aside and talk to them. I always try to do that from the point of view, if I were in that person's shoes, how would I be seeing it? And ask them to tell me how they're seeing it. And then build on that to get them to think about how the other person or the group or whatever the situation is might be seeing their specific behavior. And are they getting the outcome they want? Are there other ways to think about trying to get it? That basic model is the kind of thing I do. I've done it, but I can't think of any specific examples at the moment.
That's okay. That's okay. Marilyn or Heidi, any thoughts on that question? No.
Can you ask the question one more time? Sorry.
Yeah, when we find ourselves in a situation with either an individual volunteer or an activity that a group of volunteers have decided that they want to do, but it seems to us that it's going to perpetuate a relationship of toxic charity, as we've been talking about it, a power over way of behaving. How might we intervene? Intervene is a strong word, but how might we coach those folks? How might we have a conversation? This is a learning. My assumption here is that this is a learning edge for all of us. We can all be becoming more aware of ways in which we inhabit privilege, even if our privilege is of education, and not among of other dimensions, but we're all becoming aware of it. And how can we learn to have direct and kind conversations with the people we live among? It's something I want to know. Thumbs up for me.
Yeah, I've had a couple of conversations recently with people really close to me about this, and I think it stems from the fact that there still is that other. There still isn't a close relationship yet with someone from the school or someone going through that experience, and so not being able to understand where an individual or a family or a community is coming from, that distance causes us to still be judgmental, or causes a volunteer to still be judgmental, because the situation or the context is so different from anything that we might understand from a certain volunteer's perspective. And so recently, I've just been trying to think of how do we tell the story if it requires an understanding of the individual or the context before a volunteer is willing to go and mentor or tutor. How do we, as Loving Houston, how do we tell the story of a child in a particular situation who has had terrible things happen to them, and because of those terrible experiences, the community, whatever, how do we tell that story in a way that our volunteers will understand that it's not the kid's fault, it's not the family's fault. There are so many different things contributing to what situation that child is in. Some other different things that we've been trying to do is, like my husband and I, we went to an integration and gentrification panel just to hear from the community what is going on, and just to be able to understand that. And so putting ourselves into those educational opportunities. Even this panel, I was telling Mary Liz as we were preparing for this panel, like I was so excited to be able to hear from Heidi and Fran, and I was telling her, like, there's a good chance that I'm going to be taking notes and I'm going to have a hard time answering the questions because I'm going to feel like I want to be learning from you guys. And so just putting myself into these types of situations, even going through these questions ahead of time, really helps me to think through all of these issues and all of these challenges. You guys were talking about toxic charity, and Bob Lupton, he's actually coming to Houston this week.
Oh.
The Noting Among You conference put on by the Texas Christian Community Development Network. So things like that, just getting out there and having these kinds of conversations with other people, I think that really helps us to take away that other mentality and help us to build relationships and just get to know people. I think that makes a huge difference.
I'd love to do a quick brain dump for the three of you for you to name resources that you're aware of. And by resource, I mean a book, I mean a speaker, I mean a website, I mean a podcast. What resources have you found helpful in helping congregations learn about best practices for partnership building, for building these authentic, mutually respectful partnership? Heidi, do you have some on your mind that you can start with? Where would you refer people?
I would probably refer people to, in the Episcopal Church, our baptismal covenant, and our life of prayer. I started building on the things that Marilyn and Fran have shared. because my work is racial reconciliation, I take the notion of reconciliation very seriously. And the mission of the church, for the Episcopal Church, page 855 in your Book of Common Prayer, is that we are called to be reconciled with God and with one another. And that very difficult work of reconciliation with God has to happen in some way, shape, or form in order for us to be reconciled with one another. So there are so many things that popped up for me as the two of you were speaking, because, you know, you were talking, Fran, about people's need to be right all the time. And I will say things like certainty is the enemy of reconciliation. If you know exactly where everybody has to end up, then we're never going to be in right relationship. And that being in right relationship has to be more important than being right. And then, Marilyn, as you were talking, I was thinking about, you know, this is, you know, yes, we need to go out and educate ourselves before we can sort of say, well, tell me what I need to know. And at the same time, we have to understand that another person's story is that person's story, and it doesn't speak for the whole group, and it doesn't, it's not a piece of information that we get to commodify and take in order to feel better about ourselves, right? So that we have to be careful that we're understanding another person's story as that person and we are both beloved children of God. And it's not that, you know, I'm going to feel better about myself and I'm going to feel like I've done something because I took, you know, 2 hours out of my evening to go and listen to this person's story. You know, that story is just an invitation into relationship. You know, but the thing that was really coming up for me is I'm thinking of some work that was happening in a diocese where people were really stuck. And we gave folks many opportunities to sort of think about, maybe you could try it this way, and maybe you could try it that way. And they traveled and they met with other people and they did all this great work. But in the end, they said, yeah, we're not going to do any of that. We're going to stay exactly as we are. We're stuck. And in that case, it was going to be an issue of maybe the bishop just needs to take this thing apart and start over. Because the things that they're so sure, even after having been with other folks and having talked about their own brokenness and their own vulnerability, they still went back to, but we know what's best for everybody else. And at that point, you know, it's really, you're no longer interested in being in right relationship. You're no longer interested in learning from anyone else. And sometimes you just have to say, well, you know what? You may feel really great about the fact that you think you're right about everything, but you're not able to do anything because nobody wants to play with you. You know, I would think that that's the very last resort, that we have to give people opportunities to grow and change. And most of the time, creating that kind of vulnerability that leads to courage, and the sort of Brene Brown thing about vulnerability and courage is wonderful. And then it's up to us as folks who are trying to organize folks to not then shame people or hurt people because they've been vulnerable with us. So this is why I have a lot of admiration for clergy, because clergy have to take all comers, and I basically have a really low kind of tolerance point for that kind of, you know, self-righteousness. You know, because to me, it feels like there's so much urgency. And as I'm thinking about the work that you all have been doing and that you're doing in All Our Children, there's so much urgency around this that we really don't have time to hold your hand through your neurosis about this. So, you know, come on board. We want to have you, but, you know, we want to have you in your best self.
So Fran's talked about her book, which is very useful for us, is a great small group study opportunity. Our book, which was published by Church Publishing in April, has a free study guide on our website and is also very useful for small group discussions. And I do think that small groups, discussion groups that have a set of norms where people can come to feel safe and talking about their own experiences and be able to examine their experiences and examine their assumptions can be very powerful growth opportunities. And this is a circle within a congregation can be a very powerful, transformative place for people. So I think that those are two resources. I've recently benefited a lot in the last couple years from a book by Debbie Irving called Waking Up White. And it was her story as an upper middle class white woman growing up in the Boston suburbs, of recognizing the racialization of the life that she was born and bred to. And she has a very a generous heart towards her parents, who meant well, but raised her, as all of us who are white, raised her uncritically in an environment of white privilege. But she really takes that apart in a way that I found very, very, very freeing. In our last couple of minutes, any other resources, or I'm sure people on the chat box are chiming in with things that we'll share around, but any other suggestions from panelists of materials or resources?
Add the book Toxic Charity.
Toxic Charity, yep, for sure. And the author's last name is Lupton?
Lupton.
Lupton.
Robert Lupton.
Robert Lupton.
I've shared the link to that book and the others in the chat box.
Great. Thanks, Mary Liz.
The Episcopal Relief and Development, in partnership with the Episcopal Church, offer Called to Transformation trainings on asset-based community development, which is formulated around a theological approach to not engaging in toxic charity, and some of the work that Fran's described. And those are offered a couple times a year. I don't remember what we've got left for this year, but we try to offer them about 4 times a year.
Great, great. All right. Well, it's time now for us to open up our conversation to the folks who've been listening in. Mary Liz, do you have some questions for us?
I do.
Good.
I'm going to start. We had a question from Kylie, who is part of a church in rural North Carolina, and their congregations are mostly English speaking, but are looking to serve communities that are Spanish speaking, Hispanic and Latino communities. And she's wondering, and Heidi and Marilyn, you two may have some resources to share and some thoughts on this, but she's looking for specific things for those English-speaking churches to be aware of as they go into those Spanish-speaking communities, of how not to cause harm. So what kind of cultural differences they should be thinking about before they go in. And I think if you've got personal experience with those, that would be helpful, but also resources on cultural competency would be great if you've got recommendations.
I think that was directed for Heidi or Marilyn first, either of you?
Well, I'm tempted. Go ahead.
Yeah, I know. Are there existing relationships? Are there? I'm not quite sure that I understand the question. So, are there like Latino Spanish language Episcopal worship communities that they want to build relationships, or are they just talking about sort of Latinos in the area around the church?
My understanding is Latinos around the church. And Kylie, if that is incorrect or you have clarifications, just let me know. These are white churches that want to do quote unquote outreach.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Fran, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, Fran.
Well, I'm thinking of St. Stephen's and Lynn some years ago, but the community around the church changed, and it became substantially Latino. And so a bunch of people in the church took some Spanish lessons and went out and knocked on doors and invited people to come and help them learn more Spanish and tell them about their culture and what it was like to come to this country. And the church grew and the neighborhood flourished. I think I'm oversimplifying, of course, but wasn't that easy. But I would say that the principles that we've all been talking about need to underlie however it is one goes about that. And I would make that wanting to learn about them and their interest. I'm always reluctant to start off with what is it you want or need, because I think that can lead you in all sorts of ways we don't have time to discuss.
I think right now people are feeling a lot of vulnerability around immigration status.
Right.
So, so for example, as a Korean American, even though I've lived in the U.S. for 53 years, I always travel now with my U.S. passport, because one of the ways that Asian people are racialized is that we are perpetual foreigners and non-citizens. So I think particularly in this time, there may be other kinds of social service agencies or community resources that, you know, you could connect with first before it looks like, you know, hey, we're the white folks and we're showing up, just to learn about, you know, what's going on in the community, where are people feeling threatened and vulnerable. One of the pieces that I've been assigned as part of our Becoming Beloved community work in the Episcopal Church is to do a census and an audit of our practices. And this is a really tricky time to be thinking about doing a census of the Episcopal Church, especially when we have so many immigrants and refugees who feel really vulnerable. So the church showing up to say, who are you? What's your background? What's your citizenship? How long have you been here? That feels scary in this moment. So I think that that's a thing to keep in mind. And, you know, schools are a great place where lots of different kinds of families are coming together. So it's, you know, it's great that, you know, sometimes it just starts out as a, hey, we're going to go be reading buddies for the kindergartners in that school down the street. And I know that there was a parish in Washington State where I am that was very reluctant to have anything to do with their Latino neighbors until they created the Reading Buddy Partnership. And then it was kind of, there was still a little bit of that paternalistic, well, you know, those people, but, you know, my reading buddy, boy, she's a genius. She's gonna be the next president of the United States. But it was how they started in a place that was resistant. So actually those school partnerships, again, coming in a place of humility and service, can sometimes be a place where churches can learn more and have, you know, have a common interest of wanting to hold up the school and hold up those children.
Wonderful.
Next,
let's just go on to the next question, Fran, if that's okay. Another question, Mary Liz?
Yep. Tom from Transformation Jacksonville is part of a majority African American congregation. And so his congregation are made up of a lot of folks who have been on the receiving end of toxic charity at some point in their lives. But as a congregation, their instinct is still to approach their outreach from a toxic charity perspective. So just saying, we're going to go do this and then doing it. And he's wondering if there are some specific tips you have for starting the discernment process within the congregation in a way that doesn't deter the congregation from wanting to continue to do good work, and without being overly insulting to what some people consider sacred cows, or how to invite people into that congregation and really reflect on what they're doing in the community.
Well, I'm going to jump in and point this one to Fran too, because I think the principles of learning how to do relational one-on-one meetings is a fabulous way for people within congregations who think they've known each other for many years to find a deep heart commonality. And my experience with congregations is that when the individuals have done that work as individuals, the church discerns its own shared collective gift or charism. And that's the most solid place from which a congregation can then reach out to its community, because there's a sense of clarity about who we are collectively, what our passions are, what our calling is, who God is calling us to be here in this neighborhood at this time. And with that clarified, then looking for your partner in the community becomes a little bit easier. Maybe it'll be a school, but maybe it'll be something else. But I said I was going to post that over to Fran, and then I went ahead and answered the question. So Fran, would you like to add anything more?
Nicely done, Lolly. only thing I would add is there is a question that I find particularly productive. We go into churches and do what I call one-to-ones, relational meetings, do a little training on how to do a good relational meeting. which focuses primarily on getting at each other's story. And the question that leads to that story that I find so, I haven't found anybody yet who doesn't find it something they like doing. And that is, what is one of your first memories of injustice? And how has that informed your life? Now, there is nobody, you get dramatic stories, you get simple stories, but there's nobody who hasn't experienced injustice and have a way in which it's framed how they see things. And it brings people closer together faster than anything I've ever seen. I do think people learning to ask the questions so you get there takes a little bit of work, but not much, just.
Great, thank you. Next question, Mary Liz.
So we have a number of people on the call with various kinds of feeding programs. Actually, the majority of the people on the call said that they definitely have feeding programs. And we have questions about how, because of the transitional nature or the transient nature of a lot of the folks who benefit from feeding programs, especially soup kitchens and food pantries, things that serve homeless populations, how when it's hard to build those relationships, how the congregation can still be offering that program with this mutually transformative justice perspective in mind, whether it's building relationships with other organizations in your community who do complementary services, or other ways that they might be able to sort of broaden the perspective that they have when they're serving a population who are very hard to be in relationship with, or who are not engaging reciprocally in a relationship.
I know one of the things that I noticed with feeding programs is that you always have people who are willing to come and make the food and serve it and clean it up, and you don't have as many people who are willing to sit down and share a meal with the folks that you're feeding. And I think if we could kind of shift that framework a little bit, maybe if you've got, people who come by every week and they don't really want to come into the church at any other time, but they're coming in the feeding programs, maybe one time you say, hey, would you be willing to help us serve the food next time? And I think that the places that have kind of shifted the roles and maybe kind of mixed it up a little bit, and in particular had young people come in and just sit down and share meals with the folks who are serving, that it's a little bit of a first step. Because, for a lot of folks who, for whatever circumstances, have ended up needing the feeding program, that issue of pride and of feeling, wanting to feel the full dignity that was given to them by God, that we sometimes forget that, yes, we can ask those other folks to come in and be part of the workforce, and that we can be the ones who receive the gift. And I've seen that happen. And I know that one of my colleagues wanted to say, like, the next time we go to a general convention, instead of the diocese going out to some fancy restaurant, let's talk to all the feeding programs that we're going to be in Austin next summer. Let's talk to all the feeding programs in Austin, and we will go in and we will make dinner for those people, and while they tell us about their ministry, to really kind of shift the frame of who's serving and who's being served. And I don't, that might not work in every place, but I definitely think also, like, getting the young people in there and doing it intergenerationally, and, doing things that are more than just feeding, maybe things that are fun, like to have a silly little raffle for, I don't know what, a package of socks or something, that allows people to sort of engage in a way that is, that is a mutually shared sense of fun, and an experience that everybody's enjoying together.
Wonderful. I think we might have time for one more question, Mary Liz.
Great. Marilyn, I think I'm going to put this one to you first, because you work with a lot of congregations who are building volunteer teams, and this is a really straightforward, how can we get more volunteers from our parish who are willing to volunteer on a team to do something? This is from Carlo, and he's wondering if a parish volunteer coordinator is a start. So how many congregations do you work with that have designated volunteer coordinators, and what are some of the tactics for building the volunteer base in your congregation?
Uh-oh. Oh no.
I think we can hear you, Marilyn.
Oh, you can? Okay.
Yes,
It keeps saying it. Okay, great. Yes, we encourage every partnership to have a volunteer coordinator. Just having that one person to be able to be that champion to recruit volunteers, that is huge, huge, huge. Another thing that we see is being able to tell stories of impact. The volunteers want to know that they actually are making a difference. And a lot of times when they're meeting with that third grader and that third grader is not saying anything to them, they don't feel like they're making an impact. But then if the volunteer coordinator is able to go and talk to the teacher and get some kind of feedback, or talk to the parent and get some feedback, and then bring that back to the volunteer, that is huge. So telling those stories of impact. I think a big thing is what we were talking about earlier, just figuring out like why the church is doing what we're doing, and being able to have that conversation at a congregation level. That way everyone's on the same page about why we're in partnership, the bigger picture of why we're in a partnership. It's not to save the people, although, I mean, and that's another conversation for another day. But being able to all be on the same page, having the pastor be involved in the partnership and being able to preach from the pulpit. One really cool thing that we just found out about in our partnership at our church is that one of our pastors is going to be a mentor this year. And so I think that is going to be huge for recruiting volunteers, because he's going to be able to share his personal experiences from the pulpit. So that I'm so looking forward to seeing that happen. But telling all sorts of stories of impact. And I mean, there's so many different ways that volunteers can be involved. Even if you have just a mentoring program, I mean, there's so many different things that different people in your congregation can do, right? So some people can be mentors. Some people can be a prayer partner. They could be the one behind the scenes praying for the partnership. A lot of schools have like a cabinet full of activities. So someone could be in charge of stocking that cabinet full of activities, making sure it's organized. So all sorts of different things, like knowing your congregation, knowing their gifts, and being able to find different things that match those gifts. I think that would be huge as well if you're trying to recruit volunteers.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's time for us to turn towards our closing. And we value the feedback of those of you who've been listening into this conversation. And we'd like to ask you please to use the chat box now to find a link to a brief 3-minute evaluation survey that we will use for our own learning and continuous improvement. And also to type into the chat box your own answers to these 2 questions. What worked well for you in your own experience? Think in terms of the technology, the content, the speakers, the structure of the whole thing. What worked well? We'd love to hear that. We'd also love to hear from you what you suggest we do differently next time. So we take this very seriously. So please help us out by filling in the evaluation, the questionnaire, and also those 2 questions: what worked well and what did not work so well. The recording of this webinar is available on our Facebook page, and it will also be posted on our website, so you can retrieve it and look at it later with folks in your congregation or other friends and colleagues. Our next webinar is November 28th, again, a Tuesday afternoon from 2:30 to 3:45 Eastern. Our topic is You Don't Have to Do It Alone. Finding and building on your local resources. And our panelists include the Reverend Rebecca Larson Bean, who is the partnership leader for a middle school partnership in Goldsboro, North Carolina. Ansel Sanders, President and CEO of Public Education Partners in Greenville, South Carolina. And Tamara Plummer, the coordinator of the Episcopal Asset Map. So I hope you'll join us for that. You can sign up and get more information at allourchildren.org/webinars. And I want to tell you a little bit more about our national learning event that I referred to earlier. All Our Children, the Church's Role in Education Equity, will take place January 16 to 18 in Columbia, South Carolina. This 3-day conference will feature local and national leaders in interactive workshops, engaging panel discussions, as well as 2 keynote addresses. One from Jeff Duncan Andrade, a nationally recognized educator, and the second from Michael Curry, the presiding bishop of our Episcopal Church. Discounts are available for teams of 4 people or more. And you can find program descriptions and registration information at aoc2018.org. This webinar has been produced with technical support from Julie Lytle, the Executive Director of Province 1, the Episcopal Diocese of New England. And once again, thank you to our panelists, to Heidi Kim, to Marilyn Lee, and to Fran Early for being with us, and to Mary Liz Murray, who keeps all things together here at All Our Children. And finally, thank you to all of you for everything that you're doing in your communities. Thank you for the work that makes a difference in the lives of children, of communities, and congregations. God bless you, and goodbye.